Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today, I want to talk about a few of the books I read during June, Pride Month, where we celebrate lesbian, gay, and bi people, trans folks, and everyone else who stands under the general queer umbrella. You might be thinking to yourself that we're no longer in June. In fact, we're no longer even in July. To which I would say every month is Pride Month. And it's the time, after all, for acknowledging that boundaries are quite a bit more flexible than we might have initially been taught. We don't need to be restrained by boundaries about timing either, right? First, I want to talk a bit about two books that I think I mentioned in one of my forthcoming monthly wrap-ups. The first is Rachel Carson and the Power of Queer Love by Lida Maxwell, published by Stanford University Press. This is the story of how Rachel Carson's intense friendship with Dorothy Freeman made an enormous impact on her book, Silent Spring. Maxwell makes the argument that Carson's love for Dorothy opens up a place of social critique, which had not been part of Carson's previous work. Let me read out something from the jacket. As their love unsettled their heteronormative ideas of bourgeois life, it enabled Carson to develop an increasingly critical view of capitalism and its effects on non-human nature and human lives alike. And it was this evolution that made the advocacy of Silent Spring possible. I'm not going to go into the weeds of what evidence Maxwell marshals for this argument, but essentially she suggests that same-sex love, at least at that time, was less about what she called consumptive desires, that is, the desire for straight couples to acquire land and turn it into residential property, equip their homes with goods to impress others, breed children who will do the same, etc. She's a little more nuanced in what she says than what that quote implies, but fundamentally, I just don't see that as being true, at least during my lifetime, when gay male couples were often more visibly consumptive than straight couples at large. But nevertheless, I fully understand her point that a loving relationship with another person, another thinker, can support substantially more developed and perhaps risky ideas to emerge in one's work. You might already see from this quote and the type of argumentation, and perhaps just from knowing who published Maxwell's book, Stanford University Press, that this is quite academic. Rather than being narrative nonfiction tracing the details of a relationship between Carson and Freeman, this is thesis-driven work, and the thesis has much more to do with the idea of queer love and its impact than it does with Carson and Freeman. And that relationship between Carson and Freeman is not quite as clearly queer as Maxwell implies, at least not by what she refers to in this text. Dorothy Freeman was married to a man. Her spouse was close friends with Rachel Carson as well. Was this a relationship that was more than, quote, just friends? Especially in those days of mid-century America, when there were more barriers between men and women, friendships between women were quite often the source of a lot of significant emotional connection for both straight married women and other women. And if you look at letters between women friends in the 19th and 20th century, correspondents quickly and easily use romantic terms of attachment to talk about their friendships with other women. Plenty of people use this kind of language when talking about their sisters as well. In other words, love? Absolutely. But not necessarily queer love. And of course, many of us still see our same-sex friends as sources of deep emotional connection, no matter what our sexual identity is. We don't have evidence, or rather we don't see evidence here, that Carson and Freeman had a sexual relationship. But I don't think that matters for Maxwell. She's talking about love between two people, and I certainly agree with her on this point in two ways. The love between people can lead to much more interesting work, and second, that Carson and Freeman did, in fact, love each other, even if their love was not necessarily queer by most people's definitions. What shows that love in this book is mostly beautiful letters that the two wrote to each other. This is not a collection of those letters, but there are, of course, a number of quoted sections. I don't think I've ever been as quick to look in the footnotes whether there was a published collection of their letters. That, I knew, would be a book I needed on my bookshelves. More in my quest in a future video sometime. Okay. I also read a somewhat related book called Forest Euphoria, The Abounding Queerness of Nature by Patricia Kaishian. This book, despite a few reservations on my part, is a much better read. You know, I say that, but now that many weeks have gone by since I finished these two works, I must say it's the flawed work of Maxwell that is really the one that stuck with me the most, not because of its writing or thesis, but because of the way it introduced me to the friendship between Carson and Freeman. But let me tell you a bit about Forest Euphoria. Kaishian, the author whose name I fear I might be mispronouncing, creates a narrative that braids together her scientific naturalism with a memoir of sorts. She's a trained scientist, and part of the book is introducing us to a diversity of species that we might not know much about. In almost every chapter of the book, she pairs the interesting weirdnesses or surprises of the lives of particular species with a moving way of talking about what that diversity of life means for us. Kaishian considers herself queer. She considers herself a woman, but she acknowledges that there have been moments since her early childhood when another part of her emerged as well. Matthew, as she calls that part of herself. These moments, these experiences, are not the only moments where clear binaries don't seem to express who she is. She finds herself having romantic relationships, sometimes with women and sometimes with men. She doesn't fit into boxes when it comes to race either, etc., even her neurodivergence. Before I get into the author's arguments, let me say that this is in general a really beautifully written book. Not just clear, as you might expect from a scientist, but poetically written, with a real sense of rhythm and sound in almost every sentence. The book uses scientific discussions to inspire a more poetic, a more metaphoric discussion. And although I do admit I occasionally rolled my eyes at some of the most egregious reaches in metaphor, in general, I found the book really lovely and thoughtful. What she sees in nature and in science confirms that various kinds of binaries are often far less rigid than we assume. In different chapters, we get fascinating discussions about mycology, about cicadas, and the keeping of time, etc. One of the later chapters goes into a long talk about eels and how a special kind of magnetism helps them move from their birth in the ocean and later migrate to fresh water. This loosens up another kind of binary, right? Crossing from salt water to fresh and then back to salt water near the end of their lives when they're about to breed. The author explains how magnetite in the eel's bodies, which is sensitive to Earth's magnetic fields, assists in their ability to migrate, as it does for many migrating species, apparently. These eels are born with no observable sex characteristics. Sex determination, in fact, only happens in their last year of life. This intrigued a lot of scientists. Interestingly, Sigmund Freud was one of them. He dissected roughly 400 eels looking for internal evidence of reproductive organs. In only one of the 400, he found testicles. Let me read out a paragraph that follows, one quite a bit less subtle than most of the author's thinking. It's clearly a place where she has absolutely lost her patience with how scientists' pre-existing assumptions have made it all but impossible for them to acknowledge what is right in front of them. Central to Freud's obsession was a fundamental failing to account for or accept the potentially non-binary and queer realities of other life forms. While undoubtedly interesting, the fact that eels are intersex for the majority of their lives is only shocking in the context of heteronormative culture. The influence of heteronormativity is evident in every step. The questions asked, the investigative methods chosen, and the resulting panic when bias was not easily confirmed. How unscientific. To me, the most interesting binary the author disrupts in this book is the one between humans and other life forms. She has this tremendous sense of the unity of life, including with the metaphorical, quote, life of a forest or swamp, created by the interdependence of various plants and animals and other growing things living in one environment. Okay, the third book I want to mention is quite a bit different. It is Too Good to Get Married, The Life and Photograph of Miss Alice Austen by Bonnie Yochelson. I thought Jane Austen July might be an appropriate time to talk about this book, since Alice Austen spelled her surname the same way Jane did. Anyway, my copy is a floppy advanced reader's copy, but what you'll find in the bookstore is a lovely hardback. I really enjoyed not only learning about Austen, but also looking at the photographs, and I'll show you a few in just a minute. When she was growing up in Gilded Age New York, Alice Austen became obsessed with photography. In her early work, she wanted to capture the social rituals of the leisured class, what she called the larky life of not only lavish parties, but boat races and tennis matches, etc. That all sounds like the work of someone who accepts her social position, doesn't it? But it becomes more complicated. By the time she was in her mid-20s, she was taking pictures of her female friends in their undergarments or in men's clothes. Sometimes the women were mocking supposedly masculine behavior by pretending to smoke cigarettes or get drunk. At some point, Alice Austen decided she was too good to get married, and she began to conceive of herself as a rebellious new woman who might seek out higher education or choose to work and spend time playing sports, maybe. And she began to have romantic relationships, not with the men her society thought she should marry, but instead with women. Soon she met Gertrude Tate, with whom she spent the rest of her life. This book, Too Good to Get Married, is the first serious biography of Alice Austen in decades. It's the story of a woman, who we would now probably call lesbian, who became a fairly important photographer at the end of the 19th century. But it's also an intimate peek into the lives of the elite women of her social class, as well as a discussion of that era's ideas about gender and sexuality. Let me show you just a few of the many photographs reproduced in this book. I zoom through this book, entranced by the photos that bring to life the late 19th and early 20th century women of New York. But I might read it again next year, just to think more seriously about some of the other themes in the book. Finally, I want to mention a book I found at a little free library, a book that a viewer flagged for me not too long ago, actually. She was responding to an older video of mine about the history of lesbian literature, which I'll link to in the description box. Anyway, the book is The Middle Mist by Mary Renault. Renault, who also wrote quite a number of works of historical fiction, lived in South Africa with her female partner for more than 3 decades. And there she escaped some of the most intense homophobia of England, where she grew up. She also escaped the censorship, allowing her to write about queer characters. The Middle Mist, published in the mid-1940s, was the U.S. title of The Friendly Young Ladies. From what little I know at this point, the book portrays lesbianism as an acceptable choice that could lead to long-term happiness. a very different portrayal from earlier books like The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall. Despite finding a copy of this book more than a month ago in this classic little plastic wrapper that Pulp Fiction's often stored in used bookstores, I have not read this one and probably won't. Not because of the subject matter or the book's approach, but because this particular copy smells so much like book mold. I promised a friend that it will be hers as soon as I finish filming, since the smell apparently does not bother her. But I will be holding up another edition, possibly just a digital copy, sometime soon. I'm going to put this one way away from me. Thank you for your patience about the delay in this video, and thank you for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.